Hi, welcome to this the latest episode of the Wellbeing Show. Excuse me. I've got Neil with me, who's a licensed psychologist in California, and he'll tell us what that means at some point. If we get to it, we might have another round of conversation that goes off at another tangent. We'll see. And we're going to be talking. He's just got a book out around trauma as a thief, which is a fantastic and interesting concept, and one that sort of I really, when I saw it, I went, yeah, I want to talk to this guy about this. It's a really interesting idea. And I think it resonates with a lot of people who may have experienced trauma. Certainly resonates with me as a clinician. Just to remind you, this is pre-recorded. So don't call me during the show because I might be doing something else. But the number you can contact me on is 07 506 319 745. You can use that for WhatsApp. If you're outside the UK, it's +44, delete the first zero. Send me some WhatsApp messages. If you've got messages for Neil, I can pass them on to him. And without further ado, I'm going to say, hi, Neil. How are you doing?
I'm doing very well, Noel. Thank you.
Thanks for your flexibility earlier this week. I had something to sort out, Neil. Very kindly bumped to another day. So to like 8 a.m. in the morning for you, it's sort
It
of
is. Yep.
4 o'clock here. So you're way over in one of my favorite places, California. Is that where you grew up? Is that your sort of home base?
Pretty much. My father was career military, so we moved around quite a lot. But fortunately for me, he retired when he was stationed in Southern California. So I have lived most of my life in Southern and Northern California. I went north for university. So
There's a large military base in San Diego, isn't there, of Marine.
yeah, he had been at San Diego. My sister was born there, and then when he retired, he was at the Long Beach base, which has been closed. So yeah,
Yeah, was he Marine or sort of something
he
else?
was U.S. Navy. Yeah,
US.
U.S. Navy, 22 years. Yeah.
Okay, great. And you sort of like a lot of children who have military parents, that meant you moved house quite a lot, I presume, as a
That's
child.
right. That's right. Yeah, I have a short story in a friend's book about boyhood, wanting to know salient aspects of boyhood, and mine was titled "We Moved a Lot."
Yes.
So that was the yeah,
Yeah. That's one of the issues about sort of, and some of the sometimes it's like difficult to form and maintain friendships because you go to one school and then you just know you're going to go and
absolutely, yeah.
it's
If you
interesting. Military families, certainly in the UK, have specific types of pressures on the children. So if the children do something wrong, it's the commanding officer gets involved in terms of the UK military. So there's a lot of pressure on the kids to behave well and not sort of get in trouble. Otherwise, the whole hierarchy of the military forces goes. Is
absolutely, yeah,
that the
yeah,
same in the US? Yeah.
yeah. I think so. Yeah, and I think the higher in rank your parent is, the greater the pressure. So
Yes.
yeah.
So you didn't act out, I imagine. You didn't have a sort of standard adolescence, or did you? Did you just run?
Um, I was a challenge to my father. Yeah.
Good for you. Good for you. Was it just you, or do you have siblings as well?
I had an older brother and a younger sister. They're both deceased at this point. So
Oh,
there
I'm
were
sorry to
three of
hear
us.
that.
Yeah. Yeah.
Sorry to hear that. Were you a close family? I mean, for the sort of
I wouldn't say so, no. A lot of what the book is about is my father was a very disturbed man,
right.
and that his pathologies really colored the fabric, the experience of the family. So
Okay. Yeah, I mean, I grew up with a very disturbed father as well, so I can identify with that. My father came from this sort of Irish, sort of Republican side of things, and lots of trauma and inherited sort of intercommunal violence and all that sort of stuff. So, but there's a legacy around that stuff. What was your father's background then before the military?
well, interestingly, and I talk about this in the first part of the book, he comes from his grandfather was the first to come over from Ireland.
All right.
And during the occupation, the land was taken away. They had very little left. They escaped. He was at the end of the 19th century. My mother's family had been here for 2 centuries. They came over, the earliest ones on the Mayflower. So
Yeah.
a big and so on the one hand, there's I inherited the blood of the occupiers of Ireland for 8 centuries, and then the Irish themselves. And my father comes from a line of angry Irishmen. And I think a lot of his pathology, its roots were in the prior generations. So
Yeah, yeah. There are quite a lot of angry Irishmen, or there used to be. Ireland's changed a lot, I have to say. I go over there now, and since the Good Friday thing, there's a really great young band at the moment that I'd be listening to called Kneecap, of all things.
decaf.
They're great,
Oh,
absolutely
I'll have
fantastic.
to listen to them. Yeah, it sounds
Yeah,
interesting.
I think they're Belfast based. I've been listening to them on BBC Radio, and
Oh,
they're sort of really interesting, sort of energetic young people turning these troubles into art and sort of moving on. And
fantastic. Yeah,
isn't it? It was sort of
yeah,
a
yeah.
great thing. So your father was troubled before he joined the army. It wasn't the army itself and the experiences.
The Navy, not the Army. But yeah, so he was a seagoing guy. But yeah, well, I think so. I mean, I spent a lot of time looking for the roots um, of it all. He was a pedophile. He was an alcoholic. He was a bully. He was an angry man. You know, he could be violent. So I don't think that just appears. You know, when he joins the Navy. I talk about formed a close friendship with my mother's older brother, which is how my parents met. And at one point late in life, my uncle took me aside and said, "I just need you to know, get this off my chest, that the Navy investigated your father for homosexual activities early in his career, and he stayed in the Navy, so they must not have determined that he, you know, anything illegal. But so yeah, I think it was all there early on. So
Yeah. And sort of growing up in that must have felt quite unsafe, I imagine, as a child. So
well, you know, one of the things about a military family and moving all the time is you only know your own reality. So it was one of the things I talk about in the book is the rest of my family are gone. I believe that my father's pathologies caused their early deaths,
right.
and I survived and I escaped. And so the book is a lot about my using my professional training to look at my lived experience in the family and use it as a case example of surviving trauma.
Now it's interesting, I think, and thinking about how there's two things that I add to that fascinated me. And one thing that I've always had a fascination with as a clinician and as a survivor myself is why do some people survive? What is it that happens that some people can survive and some people don't? Not as a judgmental thing, but I'm really interested in this notion of transformation. That's one thing. The other thing is the link between the wounded healer and the healer. And there's a whole mythos around that, and I'm sure you've investigated both those subjects. But let's stay, if you don't mind, a little bit with the backstory, the growing up, the military,
Absolutely. Yeah.
particularly. We're
Yeah.
sort of similar generations, I guess, and sort of certainly in my childhood, there was obviously now, if we were looking at a family like mine, one would hope that the dysfunction would be noticed,
Right.
that people
Absolutely.
would say
Yeah.
something about it.
Yeah.
I grew up at a time when nobody would talk about these things. And it was considered a private matter. So the domestic abuse, the alcoholism, all that sort of stuff was considered a private matter and nobody would dare intrude. But one
Exactly
would
the
hope,
same.
and I presume that's the sort of similar story to your family.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. I think the other side of that is you don't have any external reference. You don't hear about being a child of an alcoholic. You don't hear about social services removing children because they're being abused. That just didn't exist. It was a private matter and nobody talked about it, even within the family. And so you've got this suffocating silence within the family as well. So
Yeah. And that normalization thing, all kids go through it. Every child assumes their own experience of child is the same as everybody else's. Everybody's childhood is like mine, that normal thing. And I remember, and I don't know if you had these experiences, but I remember for once going around to a friend's house after school and breaking something by accident in the house and having a freeze reaction because in my house, if I broke something, I'd be assaulted. That's what would happen. That was the parenting style that I faced. In my friend's house, they didn't assault me. They were more concerned about me. And I thought they were strange. That You know?
So, yeah, we do have a lot of parallels. When I became an adolescent, my friends' parents thought that my parents were a bit strict and a bit odd. And so they protected me and they took me in and they would occasionally lie to my parents to get me out of the house.
Yeah.
So, of course, I loved that, but I also made me aware that maybe not all families are the same.
Yes.
Maybe there are some interesting differences. So,
And that sort of sense of the hidden nature of it, I guess, was reinforced by being A, in the military, and B, moving around a lot, because that's one of the reasons why these days we wouldn't spot sort of abuse is because a family just disappear and move somewhere else.
right, exactly. Yeah.
And that's a sort of abuser's charter, isn't it, really, to be able to move the family around and not have continuity of care through the doctor, school, etc.
Yeah. Unfortunately, it's an ideal scenario for the abuser.
It
Yes.
really is, isn't it? That you can
Yeah.
sort of control them.
Yeah.
What was, I mean, you have survived. I mean, if you look back on your childhood and that frightening thing that was happening, and then your move into sort of psychology, how were you like in school, for example? How was that for you as a reparative force or not?
I was in my family, I had the role of the family hero.
Yeah.
So I was the one who went out and met the world. I was an excellent student. I was a sufficiently accomplished athlete to get attention in a couple of sports. I was very socially adept. I had a lot of friends.
Yeah.
The rest of my family kind of cowered, and it's almost like there was a like my father had a kind of gravitational pull into the pathology, and for some reason I resisted it. I went the
Yeah.
other way.
Yeah.
So, to your earlier point, it fascinates me as well. I don't fully understand it, but
Yeah. Well, I guess we're always trying to decode that. Tell me a bit more about this family role thing. So you just used that term, I played the hero. Now, often the hero is presented to the world to sort of as a mask of normality. The family must be okay because this person is very successful, that sort of thing. What other roles exist in these types of families, would you say?
they it's been a while since I've read this literature and they have names, but there's the sufferer, the tyrant, as my father was.
Yeah.
Uh, but you're absolutely right. One time there was a parent-teacher conference at my high school, and when my parents arrived, they addressed them as Mr. and Mrs. Neal. So they were acknowledging me more than they were acknowledging the family.
Oh, good
And
Lord. So they realized what they were doing.
yeah, yeah.
That sort of reinforced that role because there must have been a huge amount of pressure on you to present the best image for the family, but given it was so dysfunctional.
And I, of course, didn't realize it at the time, but you're absolutely right. And
Yeah.
I was the one who, went out and met the world. And exactly as you said, well, he's okay, so they must be okay.
Yeah.
Though I wasn't okay. It was just that I had a convincing mask. So,
And also, I guess to some extent, your mum might have thought that as well. At least Neil's okay, so we're doing something okay. And that sort of almost that projection or onto you from um,
I think so. Yeah. I mean, they could point to me as a success story. At the same time, she was 18 when they were married. She found out early on that he was having affairs with young men. She tried to leave a few times. She didn't succeed. So she was pretty compromised herself, and she was depressed, and she was an alcoholic. And so um, I think it took all, and she died at 53. It took all that she could manage just to survive.
And we also, I mean, we have to think, look back in compassion in some ways on these things. Otherwise, we tear our minds apart, for one thing. But also because in those days, particularly with women, they were highly economically dependent.
Right.
There weren't very many options. My mum was unusual in that she did leave my father when I was 8. But she only was able to do that because she met my stepfather. Otherwise, it wouldn't have been possible
Yeah,
economically.
exactly. Exactly
She's
right.
able
Yeah.
to
And
set
so
up a new home and all that sort of stuff.
my mother graduated high school. Her parents had not graduated high school.
Yeah,
So she had no training. She was going to go to secretarial school. She
right.
met my father. She's, off she went with a new Navy bride, moving from place to place and had
Yeah.
3 kids by the time she was 25. So
Wow, that's quite. And what was the sort of relation with the siblings like? Are you okay to talk about that?
Yeah, I talk about that quite a bit in the book. My older brother, this goes to the how trauma affects people. He sort of emulated my father's life. He became a military officer. He had a secret life. There's every indication that he and my father were collaborating in some way in their secret lives. I don't even want to know more detail than I know about that.
Sure.
Uh, my sister and I were very close. We were absolutely best friends all through childhood, and I think it helped both of us survive our childhood.
Yeah.
She unfortunately had that addiction gene. I was the only one in the family not to have it.
Yeah.
Even today, my partner and I enjoy wine with dinner, and we don't want to keep drinking all night. So,
Yeah.
so I feel very fortunate in that regard as well.
Mm.
So ultimately, she lasted longer than most of the others. She died at 66. She had some of the same cancers that my mother had. But
Mhm.
so my brother and I were not close. He today would be on the autism spectrum, something
Mhm.
else that didn't exist at the time. Extremely bright, extremely verbal. Even adults had trouble relating to him in a sense of being an intellectual equal. He went through the Navy's nuclear school, and as soon
Okay.
as he finished it, they brought him back to teach in the nuclear school.
Right.
So that's so with that kind of intelligence, you don't find too many peers. You don't find a whole lot of social ease. And he was an angry guy. I mean, I got on the receiving end of his fists more than once. So
Right. Right. And so he formed a sort of collaboration with your father. They became, and that was his way of surviving, or maybe just identifying with.
yeah, I think yeah, we were like magnets faced apart. So he went toward my father, I went away from my father.
Okay.
Um,
Yeah.
he was the oldest. My father once said, my father sexually abused both of us and physically abused both of us. And my father once said in a rare moment of candor, well, your brother got the worst of it. He
Mm.
didn't elaborate. I had very little success getting my brother to talk about any of that. So,
Yeah. We should note, I mean, we talked about this before the show, that if they were going to, if we were going to be mentioning potentially triggering subjects, we're going to stop and just acknowledge
yeah,
that some of these subjects are difficult to listen to, particularly if, as you're listening, you haven't had the amount of help that I've had and that Neil has had, quite clearly. But the message here is that there is help available for this stuff. And you two can sort of learn how to manage these experiences. So, one of the key features of a successful life, I would say, and I'm going to check with my colleague Neil as well, is that you learn this skill called help-seeking behavior. That you look for help and you keep going until you get the help that you need, because you will. It's not the particular form of the help. I mean, I think my experience has been having worked within trauma for a lot that different things help different people. We've got better technologies these days in terms of psychology now with EMDR and things like that, which are very successful. Um, but that doesn't necessarily work for everybody. I met somebody who was a torture victim who'd survived it, who one of the breakthroughs they got was through walking through what we call a bluebell wood when all
mhm.
the bluebells were out, and that gave them the hope that they needed to do the work they needed to get over the vile things that had happened to them. So it's really important, folks, if you're listening to this, to know that seek help, and the help is there. There's good things, and then you can see from the fact that Neil and I are just chatting about this stuff as though it's okay to talk about this stuff. That there comes a time when it is okay to talk about it, and it doesn't destroy
Absolutely.
you. Would you add anything to that, Neil?
I totally agree with you. I somehow early on gravitated to good people, people who cared about me. I think I was always a good student. I think that helped me a lot. Some people find their salvation in music, the arts in general,
Yeah.
religion, and I would say it's not only okay to talk about it, but it's important to talk about it because the shame of living with it in a hidden way and feeling responsible for it can literally be deadly. And the way out is to throw that off because it isn't the shame isn't it isn't you, it isn't me, it's something that happened to us. So
Yeah. Yeah, and it's really important, I think, to get to a point where you understand that the things that happened were rotten and horrible, and they're not. I'm not rotten and horrible.
That's right. That's right. That's a huge accomplishment when you get there. Yeah.
And it's really, really important. There are tricks that you can learn in mindful meditation, for example, becoming an observer to these things. I want to just pick up on a point that you've alluded to, and let's just look at it. The role of trauma, stress responses, etc., in ill health and in the development of physical ill health, because there is, to some extent, in some areas, still a mind-body division in the way people approach themselves, which is nonsense. It doesn't exist. It's not real.
I
Uh,
agree.
the mind and body are the same thing, literally. And trauma has somatic, physical representations, like all sort of mental health issues. And in many ways, there's a growing body of evidence that trauma may be, or stress, which is another word for trauma, if you like, extreme stress, is behind a lot of illnesses. What's your understanding of the relationship between extreme stress, trauma, and illness, and psychological sort of representations of illness, those types of things?
Well, I totally agree that we are one being. I would talk with my patients during my clinical practice about the body being a somatic reflection
Yeah.
of what our psychology is. One example of from my own experience that I mentioned in the book is I've always had a stiffness, and I'm a terrible dancer. I've been told I'm a terrible dancer, and I think that stiffness comes from not knowing where it's coming from next. And
Yeah.
so I internalized the early trauma such that to your earlier point, it was never safe. It could be someone screaming, it could be a fist, it could be, my father sneaking into my bedroom. So I internalized this tension that I'd love to not have, but it's a part of me. And then with my others in the family, I mean, my mother drank and became severely depressed. And of course, her health suffered enormously as a result of that. So,
In terms of the sort of physical illness as well, I'm thinking things like, what do you think? I think there's quite a lot of evidence now that trauma has an epigenetic impact, that it can switch on a lot of latent illnesses that wouldn't emerge. For example, any form of addiction, certain forms of cancer. It can lead to all sorts of hypertension, heart illness. Do you work in that, with that sort of understanding as well?
I think it can literally depress the immune system as well. I mean, I think it
Yes.
has that kind of a power. And so, yes, again, when I would, in my clinical practice, would talk with people about the first approach to depression, I would talk about, exercise, diet,
Right.
uh, things that they were feeding their mind,
Yeah.
meditation, kinds of things that could help get them to the point that you described earlier, where you realize that they didn't cause what happened to them, and they weren't responsible for it. It wasn't their identity, but and little by little they could begin to emerge from that. So I think, yeah, there's an absolute relationship between the trauma and it's a powerfully toxic. There's no
Yes.
question.
Without a doubt. I've become more and more interested in what's called lifestyle medicine. Do you know about this? No,
No.
it's a really interesting form of medicine that's emerging, looking at certain key factors in health and well-being. So relaxation, sleep, diet, exercise, social networks, and formalizing some of the evidence base around that into prescribable medicine, as opposed to pills. It would be prescribing what we call social prescribing in the UK. So prescribing membership of groups, interest groups, peer support groups, etc., as a way of treating illness rather than looking at the sort of end result of illness, which is ending up in hospital, and
Right.
which is all very important, but it's also there's a lot of things that are preventable. So I'm very interested in that these days. In terms of one thing I want to say is that in your story, as you understand it, as you've described it, one of the things you gravitated towards was good people. Can you say more about that and the role of that? Because I'm particularly thinking in terms of that there is an aspect of how our brain forms through our relationships with people and how we form and that sort of neuroplastic sort of stuff that happens. So you gravitated towards good people. Can you say more about that?
Yeah, I mean, it's not something that was conscious. It was something that I think just happened. And so partly I've talked with people who wonder how people growing up in the same family can turn out differently. And I think there's something intrinsic in each one of us. And so my brother was extremely bright. I had an intrinsically social side,
Yeah.
which was part of what saved my life, is that I liked people and I was drawn to people. And I could tell when people liked me. And because of, in such a negative way, my father was such a good teacher about when I get kind of a feeling from someone that they're a narcissist or that they're potentially dangerous, I back away. So so I think it's that intrinsic piece, and then it's reinforced. Um, I was a good student, so my teachers liked me. I always had a good sense of humor, and so my friends and I would laugh a lot together, and we always liked that. And I was always well mannered, so when I was at friends' homes, the parents said, "Oh, this kid's all right. We'll have him again," kind of thing. So that all sort of fed on itself. Whereas my sister was extremely shy, didn't have those social skills, and my brother again was so socially awkward. I don't think he just knew. He would spend his lunchtimes in high school playing bridge with his teachers.
Hmm.
So he was completely. So I think in many ways, even though my early life was a bumpy ride, I was fortunate.
Yeah, so you have the risk factors, but also then what you're describing are protective factors.
Yeah.
The
Yeah.
sort of pro-social aspect of yourself allowed you to get into social sphere. Also, your father had, in a way, taught you what was dangerous and what was uncomfortable and difficult, and so you went for the opposite, that sort of thing.
Exactly. Yeah.
And that gravitated. So there was that sort of balance there. I mean, I would suggest that if people are listening to this, there's a message here, which is get involved with other people. Sort of
Yes.
isolate.
With good people. Well, if you're, if you're a young person and you have the opportunity to get involved with, a group of people who spend their free time, vandalizing and doing drugs, as opposed to kids who are, like to have a good time and laugh and have adventure and maybe even, help out other people. Those are very different choices, and they're going to influence you very differently.
I mean, it's interesting. I do say to people, sometimes I work with clients who want to go to sort of peer support groups, and they don't know how to find good people. And the simple advice I give people is look at the person who laughs a lot. Look at the person who seems to be enjoying themselves and seems to be sociable. That's the person you want to hang out with. Uh,
Yeah, and people who are generous and people who are kind, and
all of
yeah,
them.
so yeah, yeah, yeah,
Absolutely. I can see you smiling about it. Even thinking about these things makes us feel good.
yeah, yeah.
And that's the power of our mind in terms of sort of thinking about this rather than thinking about the isolation and the difficulty. I just need to stop this 1 second. That's just somebody calling us. Sorry about the interruption.
That's
Um,
right.
so, again, I would say that this pro-social thing, looking at people that have good social skills, are happy, comfortable, send safe signals, is a really, really important protective factor. You got involved in psychology. What was the route into that for you in terms of becoming a clinician?
Yeah, so there were two parts. When I first when I first graduated high school, I thought I wanted to be a priest, so I went in the seminary for 10 days. And
Okay.
then I wound up going to the college where the seminarians studied.
Mhm.
And I thought I'll study psychology. And the first
There is a
psychology class,
theory, isn't there? Psychology is like modern priesthood.
religion in certain way, yeah, yeah. And for me, it has taken the place. So my first psychology class, the instructor said, "Draw the human body," and I'm no artist. And then
Right.
he walked around looking over our shoulders as we were drawing, and I felt completely naked. And I thought, he's going to see inside of me, and that scares me. So I became an English major, which I don't regret. I still today, I love devouring fiction. So it was years later. I was working at the American School in London, actually. And interestingly, my early life of moving around all the time was the perfect foundation for working with these kids at the American School in London because they moved around the world all the time and their
Wow.
parents, their families. So we recognized each other.
Yeah.
Um, and about after about 2 years there, I realized I was drawn to the academic counseling, but what moved me most was the personal counseling and the family counseling.
Mm.
And I thought, I've got a bachelor's degree in English. I don't have the background for this. So I decided to go back to school.
Right.
And so I went back and did my graduate studies at Berkeley, and from there became a psychologist. I thought this seems to be the work I should be doing. I'm not as prepared as I need to be to do it right. I'm at risk for making mistakes, and so I went back to school. And then the result was I came out. I didn't come out a psychologist, but I mean that led to my becoming a psychologist. So
Yeah, I mean, I guess being a psychologist is an ongoing negotiation, isn't it? So we sort of learn more as we do it. And so you would, after you qualified, what were you drawn to do in terms of practice? Because you could have stayed within academia, I guess, and doing research, but somehow you were drawn into helping people.
yeah, so I thought when I started my graduate study at Berkeley, I thought, well, I'm going to study working with adolescents through the arts. That isn't what I studied at all. I wound up studying early development and roots of trauma and personality disorders. And
Yeah.
I was just drawn to understanding how all of that works and comes into place. And so I wound up then working with adults. And as I finished my graduate work at Berkeley in 1985, just as the AIDS crisis was exploding in the San Francisco
Yeah.
Bay Area.
Yeah.
So I immediately went into AIDS work, which my graduate study did not prepare me for at all.
Hmm.
So I had my new doctorate, and then I had to go learn how to deal with other gay men in this situation where this virus was killing people left and right, and there were certain behaviors that were so. So I wound up, that became a large part, death and dying became a part of my clinical practice. Early trauma became a part of my clinical practice. Childhood sexual abuse became a part of my clinical practice.
Yeah.
Uh, Working with adolescents in the context of their families. So those were all areas that I worked in during my clinical years. Eventually, I did gravitate back to the university, and I was at one point full-time clinical practice, and then I would teach a course or two. And then I was offered a full-time appointment, became a professor, became more of an administrator. And then little by little, my clinical practice sort of, I let it die away because I started moving again to take academic jobs. So,
Okay. Okay. And so tell me about what you think about this idea of the wounded healer and the relationship between one's own experience and clinical practice and sort of your thoughts on that one.
yeah, I mean, I am a wounded healer, and the wounds I think are my most powerful tool to help other people.
Okay.
And I think it deepens my empathy. I think it humbles me in the sense that I certainly know that I'm not any better than anybody else who might walk through the door. And it has taught me a great deal about myself because I've learned about, there are people who've had much worse experiences than me, and there are people who've been more fortunate than me, and it's a continuum. Carl Rogers famously said, "Imperfect people can help other people," and I thought, "Oh, thank God." And so so it is a matter of uh, so where I think my brother particularly, his wounds consumed him. He died at 47. He drank himself to death. My wounds informed me, educated me. I would add to your earlier description of different activities and non-pharmaceutical sort of approaches to healing. Meditation was a big one for me.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
I learned to still the mind, and it really helped me see that and Jung's concept of infection of the psyche.
Yeah.
It allowed me to see that this stuff had gotten inside of me, but it wasn't me, and I could eventually, with help, push it away, and then I was free to emerge and
Also,
see
I
that.
I also I'm interested in what you think about this because I tend to feel now in the practice that I'm not so much trying to get to the root of something with anybody, but I'm helping them and supporting them dynamically in growing from those roots. That
And
we're learning to be new people. dynamically developing, and sort of we need that space in which to observe what has been, because one of the things about trauma is that it's present, it's not in the past. And much of the work is about allowing it to go into the past so that it isn't.
Yes. Yeah, I talk about it in my book. I talk about it. It's a thief. It takes stuff away from you. You can't get it back. It never goes away, but you can diminish its power. And now I feel like I have a reverse relationship. Trauma used to control my life. Now I understand it. It's over here. I've done a lot of work to put it in its place. It didn't go away. It's still there, but you can over time really diminish its power. And I feel like that's a lot of what the work is about. I knew people who would say, I went into analysis and I have a much better intellectual understanding of what happened to me, but it hasn't changed anything.
Yeah.
I've taken that to heart all the way through. The analysis is not the ultimate objective here. It is being able to help facilitate a greater quality of life or experience of life. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, insight is useful, but it has its limits. Have you come across the term analysis paralysis?
Yes. Yeah.
And again, I think the problem with that type of dyadic model that's super intense is that it forgets that, well, attachment theory tells us this, that we have primary, secondary, tertiary attachments. And those tertiary attachments are what we use to move into the world. And we're always trying to move into the world. And that, I think, has to be the direction of travel, not in here, but taking here out there as well and making there a space. What do you think about? I'm interested in this because there's been so many sort of political attacks, I think, on young people in particular, and young people finding support groups and support structures for themselves. And I'm thinking about LGBTQ safe spaces. I'm talking about gender identity safe spaces, etc., etc. I wonder what you think about that sort of milieu as somebody from my generation, because that sort of stuff didn't exist. And in
Right.
ways, people politically fought for it, and now there's something of a backlash going on.
There
Um,
is definitely,
I
yeah.
wonder what you think about that as a sort of clinician,
I think it's an enormously challenging time
right?
for young people because of social media and being easily able to lose yourself and being inundated with all of this stimulation that you can't possibly sort out entirely. And then increasingly, uh, the right is targeting people who are different. All
Yeah.
you have to be is different. And it takes us back a few generations in a certain way, and it encourages, um, it allows the person to internalize that there's something wrong with me when there isn't anything wrong with them. And so I think it's a very challenging time. Even here, my partner and I've been together for nearly 30 years. We're in a relatively conservative area of California,
Mhm.
and we get along beautifully with our neighbors, but we don't have a whole lot of gay neighbors. And so I put out a feeler to a local Facebook group of saying, is there any interest in a gay men's support group in the area? We've had over 30 people respond who want to do this group. So that they're even adults. I don't think it's subject to children. Need community, need a safe space, need a place where they can come together with others who share their difference. And so I even today I continue to dedicate energies to that for myself and for others. So.
Yeah, yeah. And that's about walking the walk, isn't it? And I think that's really important. And I think as a clinician, I have commentary on what happens in the world as well. It's a legitimate sort of place because there are psychologically healthy and psychologically unhealthy things that happen in the world. And it's legitimate for me to sort of comment on it in the same way that you are, I guess. Um,
Absolutely.
and sort of we know what happens if one's childhood is unsafe in the home. Similar things happen, I think, more broadly if one's society is unsafe. So, because of structural differences or structural inequalities, if you're picked upon because of your difference, that has psychological impacts in terms of your health and well-being, without a doubt.
Absolutely. I mean, at this moment, uh, it's become our society has become traumatic for immigrants,
Yeah,
for women, for LGBTQ people. I mean, it's not a safe space for people who are deviant in any way from the norm of the white heterosexual childbearing. So
Yeah, yeah,
it's
absolutely,
profound. Yeah,
absolutely.
yeah,
I think it bears saying as well that there are consequences for the whole of society if people get control who don't view other humans as equal as humans. There are
yeah,
significant, and it's really interesting. I mean, I sort of watch what's going on the news and people talking about this generation not being strong, whatever that means, and they're not really understanding just how tough things have become because of how unsafe it has become. Because
yeah.
we only get resilience really from having safety, emotional safety, and a good network of people that love us and care about us. That's where resilience comes from. It doesn't come from this nonsense about being a lone wolf
Right,
with an armor
right.
light. It's a real
And in a time when the social environment becomes hostile, it's all the more important to find affinity and safety with others like yourself,
yeah.
and we have to seek it out. It doesn't get provided to us necessarily.
And also, I think empower ourselves to say, I can do it. I
Yeah,
can do that as well. Like you,
absolutely.
let's
Yeah,
set up that Facebook group. Let's get some people
yeah,
involved because somebody has to do
yeah,
it. So
yeah,
why not do it yourself?
yeah, yeah,
And generally, my experience has been as soon as I make that outreach, I get lots of positive responses from people.
yeah, yeah. Yeah,
I
people, thank you for doing this. I've been waiting for this. Thanks for taking the initiative. Can't
all of
wait
them.
to meet you. So,
Absolutely.
yeah,
Yeah, and off you go. And
yeah,
that's that sort of virtuous circle thing that you were talking about earlier on. So there is something about learning that we can get caught up in a vicious cycle around our trauma, or we can flip it. It is possible to do that with help and with support over time. What sort of I always say this to people who've written books. Why were you so crazy to write a book? Because it's like it is one of the most difficult things to do, particularly a book of this sort, where you're going to have to be sort of, if you like, going through yourself in that way. I mean, what
yeah.
motivated you to write?
I say in the introduction, this was an uncomfortable book to write, and
I'm sure.
if I was successful, it will be an uncomfortable book to read.
Yes.
Um,
Yes.
but I felt like I had to. I felt like for my siblings, for people who can't give voice to their experience. I mean, I have training. I'm articulate. I can write. I'm still alive. It becomes a responsibility to try to put into words so that someone else might be able to see. Oh, this guy had this experience. It's not that different from mine. Maybe some of what he experienced, and everybody's different. I mean, my path is not everybody's path. Um, but it took about 10 years to find the voice to actually write this book in. And it's a combination of using my professional training to treat my life as a case study, my lived experience, so that I'm an ethnographer looking at my own life as a researcher and a psychologist, and then that's what the book is about.
It's interesting because in some ways, where Freud failed was his inability to look at himself.
Yeah,
You
I
look at
agree.
other people, and his major failure was that.
Yeah,
And then he ended up just writing about himself, but being unconscious that he was
yeah,
writing about himself.
yeah.
And this comes to that point about how useful is it for the healer to have some sort of insight into themselves and been through the same process, if you like, that we might invite a patient to go through. What I guess you've been through your own sort of personal therapy and group
Oh,
therapy.
multiple therapies with different kinds of psychiatrists, psychologists, Jungian analysts, and even sort of self-fashioned therapies for a period with LSD,
Yeah, yeah,
uh,
yeah, yeah.
and isolation and meditation, all kinds of things that I think are therapeutic. And one of the things I talk about in the book too is that some effective therapies are not formal therapies.
Yeah, yeah.
An effective therapy is what works for you and doesn't increase the harm, but lifts the load in a certain way. And so,
Yeah, yeah. So you started writing the book and you've set out to what, write your story, is that? But from a particular perspective?
well, I call it memoir-ish because it
Ah,
it needed the category, and so the only the editors and publishers said, well, you've got to give it a category. I said, I guess it's a memoir, kind of. But it's not just me telling my story, it's me trying to use my story to illustrate the effects of trauma and
Yeah.
to talk about ways to survive it and thrive in your own way without being Pollyannish about it and recognizing that it hurts and it leaves scars but that's just a fact of life. So
And there are limits to what can be achieved as well.
right, right,
There's
right.
only a certain amount of time in life. There's got to be some time to just live it and not get treatment, you know. So
Yeah,
um,
yeah,
having realistic understanding. So that sort of, and also just to explain to people who don't understand, Pollyannish means somebody having an overly positive attitude towards what you can achieve.
right.
Uh,
Rose-colored glasses, seeing the world in unrealistically fantastical terms, that kind of thing. Yeah.
exactly. But transformation is possible because here you are. Yeah, that's the
And here
truth.
you are. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So
Yep.
transformation is possible, but it does involve work and time. So it's memoir-ish, and you're sort of, if are you trying to? I mean, it's really interesting because I think you will understand this. There are two forms really of human culture. There's oral and literate. We're in literate. You wrote a book. And that has, literate play behavior and all that sort of stuff in child development. And there are cultures that don't go through that still. There are oral cultures that exist. But there is something powerful about stories, right? There is something
Absolutely.
almost magical about them. Um,
Absolutely.
and was that informing your thinking as you were writing this about the power of story? And because it's been with
Yeah.
us throughout the whole of human culture, right?
I love fiction, and it's become one of my the treasures of my retired life is I get to indulge in fiction a lot, and a well-told story to me is such a gift. And I feel like
Also, I
I have
think part of your Irish heritage. There's an
absolutely,
there's an Irish saying, "Why spoil the truth when it's a good?
yeah,
Why
yeah.
spoil a good story with the truth?" You
And
just
I've loved my time in Ireland just listening to the Blarney and the part of that that's the culture. And so I am using my own story again to illustrate. And I say in the beginning, trust me on this, that my early trauma catapulted me out into the world without a plan, without a map,
yeah,
but I knew that I had to get out of there to survive. And here's where it took me. And here's, what I met along the way. And here are the challenges and bumps and bruises that it's not a perfect unraveling, but
yeah,
this is the route that I took, kind of thing.
yeah,
And so,
yeah.
so yeah, there's, I think, I've had enough people read the book and react to it at this point. It seems to work as a told story, but also as a vehicle for illustration. So I've had
Yeah,
people say
it's,
that
like I say, I'm looking forward to reading. What's it called again? Tell me.
trauma is a thief.
Trauma is a Thief. And
Yeah.
how can people find it, Neil?
It's Amazon. It's available
Yeah,
on Amazon. And I assume that's available in the UK as well, but
yeah, yeah, without a doubt.
I-
Yeah, it's on Amazon. It's here.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah. Is it your first book, or do you have others as well?
30 years ago, I edited a collection of stories of male survivors of childhood sexual abuse because at the time I didn't think there was very much literature there, and so it was a collection of different people, and I was the voice kind of tying it all together. Aside from that, there have been professional chapters in books. The one short story I mentioned where we moved a lot, a poet friend put together an anthology of people, men talking about their boyhood.
Right.
Um, a colleague and I edited a 2-volume set on university management. I was a college president.
Yeah.
So it's been a mix of stuff, but this is by far the most personal thing I've written. So,
And
and I figured,
how do you feel now that that story is out there? Because there is I mean, particularly with trauma, I think there is sometimes an urge to just regurgitate, and that's not necessarily helpful. Because we can re-traumatize ourselves and secondary
right,
traumatize, all that sort of stuff. So we have to be thoughtful about that. But how do you feel now at this point in your life? Your story's out there. There's You're not dealing with certain things like your siblings sadly are dead, your mum sadly is dead, so you don't need to worry about them being included. And I'm sure you would have been if they were alive. And how do you tell that story? How do you feel now it's out there?
It's interesting. I tell people that though I started thinking about this book in some form about 10 years ago, my
Hmm.
sister died 7 years ago, and I only realized a few years after she died that she had to die before I could write the book.
Yeah, no, I get that. I understand that. Yeah.
And so I feel I have some survivor guilt. I feel some responsibility that I'm still here. I lost a lot of people in the AIDS epidemic. I feel some
Yeah.
responsibility to them that I'm still here.
Yeah.
Uh, but I have a full life. I have a good life, and the scars are part of me. But so I'm very fortunate in that regard.
Yeah. Yeah. So no sort of reawakening of some of that trauma or flashbacks or problems.
It was almost the opposite. It was almost putting it to rest in a more complete way. I learned a lot. I learned that, I mean, I knew this, but I learned that my father was an absolute monster.
It's
I knew it,
it's useful to have that reinforced.
but putting it down in writing, and I thought,
Yeah,
there
quite.
you go, you bastard. Your story is told.
Absolutely.
The whole world is going to know. And there was
Absolutely.
something liberating about that, you know?
There is, I mean, it's like there is a like this Pollyanna stuff around forgiveness, and all that, and the magic and the power of all of this stuff. No, actually, some people are just deadly and dangerous. It's good to know
Yeah,
that. And it's
and I say toward the end of my book, did I forgive my father? No, I did
no,
not.
that's right. But did you forgive yourself, which is more important?
I think so, largely, yes. I mean, I do say that, I was an imperfect human being, and my early life taught me some stuff that I would have been better off not knowing, and it took me a while to unlearn it. So, but that's a part of the process.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, look, it's been an absolute pleasure to talk to you, Neil. Really
Likewise.
grateful that I'm grateful you've written the book, and I'm going to get it myself and read it, and sort of learn something about myself from it as well. Because it seems like there's some similarities in our life experience, not the same, but
Sounds
some
like it.
is.
Yeah.
And a real pleasure to have you here. So, if people want the book, I would encourage you to go and buy it. It's called Trauma is a Thief. You'll find it on Amazon. We'll try and put a link up when the show goes out. I hope you have a pleasant day planned ahead of you, Neil, in your retirement.
We're taking my mother-in-law out to lunch, and then it's lovely spring-like weather here. We're having just glorious weather in Southern
Have
California,
you
so
got
we'll enjoy
space for food after yesterday?
that.
Good Lord.
A little bit after Thanksgiving, Evan.
Quite.
Well, no, it's been a pleasure. Thank you very much for the invitation. I've enjoyed the conversation as well. So,
You stay there while I say goodbye to the audience. I hope you all got as much from this conversation as I've got. It's been a pleasure to have Neil on. And do message me 07506 319 745 if you have any questions. But for now, that's goodbye to you lot.